So, Stephen Smith, welcome to Lessons in Leadership.
It's my pleasure, Peter. Thank you very much.
It's great to be talking to you as part of our series to speak to many past Australian Defence Ministers. I'm struck that you had quite an unusual, as it were, run-up to becoming Defence Minister. You'd spent quite a bit of time as a senior advisor to Paul Keating, and then you also were Foreign Minister for 3 years before switching portfolios. How did that background inform your thinking about what you wanted to do in the defence job?
Well, between Paul's office and Foreign Minister, of course, you miss 11 odd years in the Parliament, 3 in the government on the backbench in the Keating government's last term, and multiple domestic shadow portfolios over a long period of time, too long in opposition. But I think what really helped me in defence was having done foreign affairs first. Obviously, I learnt a lot about the Commonwealth and how the Commonwealth worked from my time with Keating, but also learning the ropes as a shadow minister is invaluable in my view. But when I look back, there are now 5 people in the Commonwealth's history who've been both Foreign Minister and Defence Minister, 4 West Australians, other than Maurice Payne, and all of the others were Defence first and Foreign second. But in my case, I've always had the view that being Foreign Minister first was invaluable to my time as Defence Minister, roughly 3 years in both, 6 years around the National Security Committee. And my approach to government was I wanted to be a Cabinet Minister, obviously, but I wanted to be prepared to be a Cabinet Minister who could make a contribution on a range of issues. So whenever a shadow portfolio change potential came up, I took it. In government, I discovered that I was focusing much less on my view of domestic matters and much more on foreign and then defence. And so that, I think, augured well for me in my role as a National Security Committee member, and that's an onerous and very important responsibility. And so when I look back, what I thought would be a domestic portfolio career ended up being a national security career. And that changes your life, and I continue, in my various roles these days, to continue to have, a keen interest in both foreign and domestic, foreign and defence and national security issues.
Well, what were the similarities and differences that struck you between foreign and defence? I mean, obviously they're cognate portfolios, but defence is different in some quite unusual way.
Absolutely. We used to, and some of my staff came with me for a period of time, or for the whole period, including some full-time DFAT, sort of professional officers. And we used to joke that our adage in foreign affairs was work hard, do good deeds, have fun. Our adage in defence was work hard, do good deeds, and there's not much fun around. We also used to sort of banter, defence is just foreign policy, but with cash and assets and capability. So there is a defence diplomacy, defence international relations, very important role, but it's the assets and the capability and the strategic deployment of those and the preparation of those which makes it different. Plus foreign, I think, with any ministerial job you do, they're all consuming. They're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the job is never done. But going from foreign, where you're dealing with words, you're dealing with policies, you're dealing with building personal and national relationships, to then go to defence was something of a cultural change, because you've got different cultures. So you've got civilian side of defence organisation, you've got the military side, you have different silos in the military side, Army, Navy, Air Force, and silos within silos. And there are lots of moving parts, and is natural and commonplace with human endeavour. When there are lots of moving parts, often they collide and you have a mishap. So defence is full of moving parts, full of surprises, and the breadth of it is much larger than dealing with foreign policy per se. So one anecdote, we used to have what we'd call double-size secure briefcases. And after a pretty quick period in foreign affairs, didn't matter what was in the double-size secure briefcase. It could have been intelligence, draft cabinet submissions, ministerial submissions, press clippings. In the end, to do that properly, not just to tick boxes, but to apply yourself assiduously, would take 3 hours. My first double-size secure briefcase from Defence took me into double digits. And eventually I got down to being able to do it in about 4 or 5 hours, resisting the temptation to just tick boxes. Because you have variable subject matters coming from various parts of a very diverse organisation. And I think that makes it difficult for any minister, but it's not something which is limited to Australia. So I'd have conversations with Bob Gates and Leon Panetta about their experiences, and whilst they're on a grander scale, given the size and scale of the US military, the difficulties that ministers have are very common throughout different countries and different jurisdictions.
That's interesting. So was the combination of workload and subject matter, did that make it like the toughest portfolio that you dealt with in your time in politics?
I think it's the toughest because of, well, if you go back and look at context, we're essentially in a war in Afghanistan, so you had that as a backdrop.
Yes.
And that, in a sense, underpinned everything. And when I became minister, my predecessor was John Faulkner. And John and I both knew I was going to become Defence Minister. And so we had a number of conversations. He was very conscious to impart to me that one had to be absolutely forensically assiduous on Afghanistan, particularly on force protection. And to his great credit, he'd done a couple of force protection reviews and had really made sure that nothing was left wanting so far as force protection in Afghanistan. He was very keen for me to continue that, which I did. But I think the advantage I had of being Foreign Minister is that if I hadn't had that prior experience, then Afghanistan may well have been the only thing that one could have dealt with. Yeah. Because I had a geostrategic view, I had experience which was relevant, then I felt I had the capacity to do much more than just Afghanistan. And in the end, you know, I ended up being the only person who sat around the National Security Committee on a continuous basis for all of that period in government. And I thought my colleagues and I discharged that responsibility in the national interest, you know, as well as anyone could have. So I look back at the national security experience and you know, you're very privileged to get that opportunity, but also proud of the outcomes and the achievements that you make.
I want to talk in some detail with you about Afghanistan, but just before we do that, the other defining feature of defence, I guess, is that you do have a number of very strong organisations in the form of the services, which have a very strong brand, if I can put it that way, their own history, their own sense of place in the broader interests of the Commonwealth. Quite a powerful culture. And, you know, a number of your ministerial colleagues have expressed just how difficult it can be to shape or influence that culture. How did you try and do that? And how did you go about establishing relationships with the two most powerful people, the Secretary and the Chief of Defence Force?
Well, I think despite, in a sense, a well-earned reputation for from time to time being highly problematic, when you're dealing with the top tier of defence, whether it's the Secretary, some of the Deputy Secretaries, you know, the Chief and the Vice Chief and the Service Chiefs, you're dealing with quality people. I mean, they haven't got to the top because they don't have capacity. And so I found it very easy to strike up good relationships with the two chiefs that I dealt with, also with the secretaries I dealt with, and the senior officials. I think one of Defence's problems is that on the military side, it's a command and control structure. And so it's very hard to have new policy or new decisions or new approaches filter all the way down. Whereas, for example, with DFAT or Foreign Affairs, if you make a policy change or a position change, the cables and the talking points and the speech notes just magically change after over 24 hours and everyone adopts the new line or the new approach. So because you've got a command and control structure with those various silos, it does make it difficult to impart things. But if you sit down and you try and work issues through with the Secretary and the Chief, and you use the diarchy well, sort of the joint structure, then you can achieve outcomes which are positive and which everyone in Defence shares. I used to say to one Chief of Staff, Chief of the Service and one Secretary, you know, they were trying to get me to agree to a notion of a thing called one defence. So I said, one defence is fine, but one defence only works when the three of us in the room, either in my office or at Russell, and we make a decision that we agree upon. When it goes beyond that, then it frays because of those cultural, you know, and command and control issues.
Yes,
but again, that's not uncommon. So I think it's the silo impact, it's the different culture, so Army, different culture from Navy, from Air Force, etc. There are small J jealousies associated with some of those, and there are silos within silos. So SASR, for example, ambivalent about Second Commando and the like. So you have these rivalries, jealousies, all within a dedicated silo.
Yes. Let's talk about Afghanistan. Obviously, this was in many ways, really for both of us, I guess, a defining experience of our time in our various jobs around the years that you were minister. We had been fighting a pretty hard fight in Afghanistan for a number of years before you came into the defence portfolio. What was your broad thinking about the sort of strategic underpinnings of Australia's position in that fight and how we were prosecuting that?
Yeah. Well, I came to the conclusion that what we needed to try and do in Afghanistan was to create an environment where the capacity for Afghanistan to be used again as a breeding ground for international terrorism would be taken away. To achieve that, we had to give the Afghans enough space to start to build their own capability and capacity in terms of Afghan national security forces, both army and police. But we could not be there forever. And so we had to work through a strategy which created space so the Afghan capability could grow, but then have an orderly transition and a departure. And that was, in very many respects, the most difficult thing to achieve and to effect. And so far as the United States is concerned, it's still ongoing.
Yeah.
But what I didn't want to occur was that Afghanistan ended up being, if you like, the modern day equivalent of the Vietnam embassy roof helicopter departure, where it was a debacle. I wanted us to make a contribution to achieve that main strategic objective, which was Afghanistan not to be a place for the breeding of international terrorism, to give the Afghans some chance in a security sense of managing their own affairs, particularly in the population centres. Everyone knows that in the back blocks of Afghanistan, warlords have run the show rather than the central or the provincial government, but the population centres were important. And I was very pleased with the way that we worked very closely with NATO, very closely with the United States, and had, I think, an influence on the way in which that was managed and the way in which Australia and other countries were able to make a contribution and then depart in an orderly way with some dignity.
We were in the back blocks. We had at that point gone to Oruzgan province. We were in partnership with the Dutch for a significant part of our time in the province. And during your time, we transitioned from essentially a force presence that was based around reconstruction to a pretty hard fight involving our special forces. And of course, once you're in that situation, there's no easy departure from it. You kind of have to stick the course. But we were taking significant numbers of casualties, people killed and wounded. We were inflicting quite a significant number of casualties on our opponents at the same time. What was your thinking about that experience as Minister, as this sort of unfolded on a daily basis?
Well, if you wind back a bit, when we first came to office, Joel Fitzgibbon, one of my predecessors, had the job of persuading NATO that non-NATO countries like Australia should actually be involved in the decision-making process. So we inherited a process where NATO made the decisions and then told the non-NATO members what was happening. So we changed that, and that occurred when I was Foreign Minister. What we then discovered was that because of what I call the Iraq distraction, so we go into Afghanistan under a UN mandate, then there's the coalition of the willing into Iraq, that then the eye is taken off the Afghan ball, and then when we go back, the Taliban have re-established. No one quite knows what the strategic nuances are. And so the Rydell review in the United States, I think, gave a lot of sense and purpose to, we can't be there forever, let's give them the capacity. So we then did two things. We increased our military contribution at the same time as increasing our civilian assistance contribution, but with the notion of pushing the Taliban back, and then we can move to the mentoring and training and give them the space. The fight was hard, and the lowest, and I know, for example, that John Faulkner, if you look at the fatalities and the casualties, in terms of fatalities, John and I had most of those. So we're the two defence ministers post-Vietnam who've had most fatalities on their watch. And that takes a toll. It takes a toll. And I know it took a toll on John. It takes a toll, and it takes a toll because a fatality just reverberates through the whole system. You know, it deflates everyone, and that's apart from the terrible grieving of a family. And so the fatalities always put a shock through the system, you know, and it affects the chief, it affects the service chiefs, it affects the whole system. And we had one day where there were 3 fatalities, insider attack, helicopter accidents and the like, and you know, multiple casualties on one day, largest number of fatalities since Vietnam. And that really sends a shudder. And you're left with, I never cease to be surprised at the stoicism of the families who are directly affected. Just great courage, great Australians in terrible circumstances. But every time there's a fatality, then the general public will say, well, why are we there? And so you've got to firstly just check your setting. Are we doing what we think is strategically the correct thing to do? And what's our exit plan? I used to have this saying, easiest thing in the world to get into an armed conflict, hardest thing in the world to get out of it. And I think one of our successes was that getting out of Afghanistan was done in a way which didn't have an adverse impact on our standing or the recognition of us being a country that was prepared to make a contribution.
Yes. Was there ever a quiet inner voice that asked yourself the question, my God, are we doing the right thing here?
Constantly.
Yeah.
I think any defence minister who's in those circumstances asks that question, particularly in the aftermath of fatalities. I think one of the things which held us well in Afghanistan was that we went in under the triggering of the ANZUS Treaty. That was subsequently buttressed by successive resolutions on an annual basis of the United Nations Security Council. So we were there with authority. It would have been completely different if our circumstances were not so authorised and it was the equivalent of Iraq. I don't think the Australian public would have given us the longevity that we had in those non-UN authorised circumstances.
Yeah. Stephen, since that time, it became apparent after an extensive investigation by Justice Brereton that, in fact, there are serious allegations to be answered about war crimes on the part of a number of Australian soldiers, which lasted over quite a number of years. But the worst of them in 2010, 2011, 2012. Do you have any sort of thoughts looking back on that experience about the sort of broader national and defence management of what was going on, which I guess was the context within which these alleged crimes took place?
I'm very happy to answer that. I'll just rewind slightly. One of the things we tried to do in Afghanistan, because of the longevity and because of what other difficulties other countries got themselves into, was firstly to try and give much more detailed reports to the Parliament and the Australian public, including a parliamentary debate. I was giving reports effectively on a quarterly basis to try and assure the public that there was a rationale to what we were doing. We were also very conscious when the handover came, when the Dutch left, we became the detainee responsible country. And I worked with Defence and with Foreign Affairs and with Attorney Generals very assiduously to make sure that the systems we put in place protected our international standing. Australia has always been a country where the quality of our military contributions have been admired in terms of their effectiveness, but also a country that abides by the rule of law, the law of armed conflict and humanitarian law. And so we were very conscious of that. And I think pre the Brereton report, you could say, well, in the circumstances of that conflict, we not only came out with our military standing intact, we came out with our international recognition as a responsible international citizen intact as well. I think Brereton, in the run-up to the release of the report, I was always confident that no one in authority in Canberra, none of the chiefs or the service chiefs were aware of these things, because knowing the quality of the people as I do, they would have told ministers. And so I was confident that no minister had had information or materials which came across his desk which would alert you to doing something. Indeed, the rumours and the suggestions only started to arise when essentially 2 or 3 years had elapsed since we'd been there. I think in a very terrible tale, there are some good points. Firstly, most countries are dragged to war crimes examinations by an external party, by an international body. We got there ourselves. And so when the rumours started to come out, Jeff Sengelman, others essentially said, this needs to be investigated. It was investigated. The current chief of the Defence Force supported that as Chief of Army, and we end up with the Brereton Report, which not only contains allegations, but in Brereton's view contains credible evidence of nearly 40 unlawful killings. And so I strongly support what the service chiefs have done in terms of response, and strongly support the government's establishment of an independent prosecutorial authority to have these tested in the criminal standard beyond reasonable doubt. So the fact that we were able to respond to it ourselves will do something to continue to maintain our standing as a country who abides by the rule of law, by the law of armed conflict. But these are terrible and shocking instances. And when you look back, Brereton himself makes the point, not only were these not sent up the line, they were deliberately designed to not be sent up the line. So that causes us to say, well, okay, what more do we need to do in those operational circumstances to make sure this doesn't happen? Clearly, there's got to be also a look at the culture, both coming in. There needs to be a look at the culture of the SASR and second commando. But the fact that we're dealing with it ourselves, I think, does give us some capacity to enable us to argue into the future that we remain a country committed to those ideals and those requirements.
Yeah, I agree. We're speaking in April of 2021, and it just so happens that America's President Joe Biden has announced an intention to withdraw the remaining American troops from Afghanistan. Interestingly enough, on the 20th anniversary of the Al-Qaeda attack on the World Trade Center. What's your reflections on that as someone who was so deeply involved with the Australian military effort for so many years?
Well, initially I was opposed to setting a timetable, as was Bob Gates and most of my ministerial colleagues. That our analysis was, if we set a timetable for withdrawal, that just enables the Taliban to not be dragged to political discussions about ending the dispute with a political compact. But in the end, we were all persuaded that to break the cycle of dependency, you had to essentially say to the Afghan security forces, you have to get yourself into a position to protect and defend the population centres on this particular timetable. And the timetable for mentoring and training, we always believed was an appropriate one. So we left, other countries left, the United States there at the beginning and ultimately there at the end. One of the things which we always spoke about publicly was what we were trying to do, stop Afghanistan being a breeding ground for international terrorism, give the Afghans the chance to manage their own affairs. But also we would say in the end there needs to be a political compact. This is essentially a civil war and there needs to be some form of compact. And those discussions over the decades, not just years, but over the decades have always faltered. In some respects, I think Biden had no choice. You know, the American people suffering from decades of conflicts in what they regard as faraway lands. And so the line had to be drawn somewhere. There's, of course, symbolism in the 20-year departure. We went there because of an attack on the World Trade Center by international terrorism, and we leave 20 years after the event. I think it will make it difficult to bring the Taliban to the negotiating table, but we've found that process somewhere between difficult to impossible over the preceding 20 years.
I hope this isn't Biden's mission accomplished moment.
Well, I think the Americans will be thinking very clearly about, okay, we'll take our personnel out, but what are we doing to make sure that the Afghans retain a capacity to manage their security affairs, particularly in the population centres?
Yes, yes. Let's turn the focus a little bit to the United States. I believe you had 6 OSMIN meetings, 3 as Foreign Minister, 3 as Defence Minister, and it was on your watch that some quite big changes happened in terms of the practical aspects of the Australia-US defence relationship. We had the Marines, 2,500 of them eventually arrived for an annual rotational exercise in Darwin. We had enhanced cooperation with the US Air Force. Talk us through the strategic thinking behind those moves.
Well, part of my strategic thinking, which evolved as Foreign Minister and crystallised as Defence Minister, was that we were living in a changing world, that the world was not just going to be about China and the United States and the extent to which that relationship was managed or not managed, but big geopolitical and geoeconomic things were occurring. You know, rise of India, rise of Indonesia as a global influence. So in the blink of an eye, India would be the 2nd or 3rd largest economy, Indonesia the 4th largest economy. So things were happening on our patch. Other ASEAN tigers are on the move, for example, Vietnam. So I came to the notion that we had to start looking at what we came to describe as the Indo-Pacific. And that culminated with the Defence White Paper in 2013, where for the first time the notion of the Indo-Pacific was introduced into Australian strategic affairs, and that's continued with the 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper that the Coalition effected, and also continued with successive Defence White Papers. So at the time, we tried to argue not just to the United States, but to India, Japan, other countries, that this was a notion we should adopt. And it was a struggle in terms of making headway. Now everyone's got an Indo-Pacific strategy. So ASEAN's got one, India has one, Japan has one, the European Union, France and Germany and the United Kingdom have one. So we cracked that sort of strategic notion, which forced us to say, okay, when we look at our part of the world, it can't just be the South Pacific, it also has to be what's occurring in our northern and western approaches. And so a range of things occurred which fell into that sort of view of where the strategic future, both for prosperity but also security, will be. So the Americans were doing a global force posture review. So I said to Defence, okay, they're doing a global force posture review. Where's ours? Because we hadn't done a global force posture review since the mid-80s when Kim Beazley and Professor Dibb did one. So I instituted our own force posture review, which fed into the 2013 White Paper. But the key thing about the American Global Force Posture Review was our very strong view that we had to keep the United States engaged in our part of the world, that what had been a tremendous success for both prosperity and security post-World War II had to continue. And so as part of those Global Force Posture Review, the Americans were looking at, let's pivot potentially some of our resources from the Atlantic, from Europe, and look at what we need to do in our hub and spoke alliance relationships in the Pacific. And so we had long and detailed conversations with them about, well, let's see if we can have some enhanced operational measures in our part of the world which reflect the notion of the Indo-Pacific is on the rise. So we struck upon what everyone sees because it's there in front of their eyes, the rotation of troops in Darwin, which started at 500 and now is at its maximum. Greater US utilisation of our bare bases in the north and the northeast and in the Northern Territory. And the third cab off the rank was always intended to be, what more can we do in terms of Navy and maritime utilisation of HMAS Sterling as what we described as our Indian Ocean capital. So it was an effort by us to make sure the US remained committed to the region. That became increasingly important and is even more important today, that we were doing things with the Americans which ran off the fabric of the alliance, but also opened up the opportunity of doing things with relevant partners. And so one of the things we spoke about was, well, Darwin, you've got Marines, you've got us, you know, we could do a disaster relief exercise with the Indonesians. If we do something out of HMAS Sterling, we can do it with the Indians. And so it was part of a fabric of growing the notion of the Indo-Pacific, but also making sure the US, remained here. And I think after 4 years of Trump, there's some unfinished work there, which I think Australia and the United States can do, which, given we're now dealing with a dramatically changed China, is even more important.
Yes. Was this something difficult to negotiate with the Americans, or indeed difficult to negotiate with your other colleagues around the NSC table? How did it play out?
Well, perversely, in a sense, there were greater difficulties with the Americans than with our own colleagues, and I had Dennis Richardson was the secretary at the time. Dennis had also been a secretary with me in foreign, and so Dennis and I worked assiduously on this for a long period of time, and we dealt with Hillary Clinton, with Leon Panetta, and also with Kurt Campbell. One of the things that we had to persuade the Americans of was that if we were going to do this, it had to be done in Australian terms. And so the starting point, anecdotally, for the Americans was, that'd be great, we'll put some Marines in Darwin, that'll be fine. So I had any number of conversations where I was saying, we don't have US bases in Australia, we have joint facilities, and if we're going to do this, it's got to be done on a rotational basis, which is fit for purpose. And that took a bit of effort with the Americans, but to his credit, when it was all over, Kurt Campbell came to me and said, that went very well, you were right, we were wrong. So, yes. So it's a classic illustration of Australia being in a position to get a good outcome with the United States, our alliance partner, but to do it in a way which works for us. Clinton was very supportive of this because as Secretary of State, we had persuaded Clinton that the United States needed to go into the East Asia Summit, that was the key piece of regional architecture in a changing world. So she signed up for the Treaty of Amity and Comity, and then Australia, working with Indonesia and Singapore, got them into the East Asia Summit, which is now absolutely essential to their ongoing presence in our part of the world.
There was a little bit of a hiccup with the announcement of this enhanced cooperation with President Obama and Prime Minister Gillard up in Darwin at one point, where the Indonesians were, for a week perhaps, taken by surprise until President Yudhoyono kind of smoothed the waters. What does that sort of tell us about the broader Australian bilateral relationship with Indonesia, and what was your thinking about how to manage that key relationship?
Yeah. Well, I had a number of conversations with Marty Natalegawa, who had been a counterpart foreign minister, about the issues. Marty thought that we hadn't alerted them enough to what we were proposing. I disputed that. But essentially, Marty was also nervous about the signal that a US military operational presence in the Northern Territory might send to Indonesia and Timor-Leste. In the event, SBY got it in a nanosecond, and it was SBY who said, this is an unambiguously good thing, we could do things, the three of us together. So look, it was a minor hiccup, but what's the lesson you learn? The lesson you learn is, with Indonesia, you always have to make sure that not only do you fully inform them, but you're satisfied that they regard themselves as being fully informed. Yeah. And one of the aftermaths of that was, for example, my commitment, which we honoured, to make sure that Indonesia was fully alerted to our thinking on the 2013 white paper, and hopefully that's something which will continue. But because of our notion of the Indo-Pacific, what I was trying to do was not just to do things with the United States, but when you look around the Indo-Pacific, what could we do to grow our defence and security relationship with other important countries? So with India, for example, I went to India pretty much every year as a minister. I got the Indian Defence Minister to come to Australia, so the first ever visit by an Indian Defence Minister to Australia. I also got Foreign Minister Mukherjee to come, who became president. And I can remember when he got in his car to drive off to the airport, he looked at me and said, "You're serious about that?" And I said, "Yes, we are serious." Now, it took a long time to mature that, but that's now clearly matured. With the Indonesians, we started doing a 2+2 with the Indonesians. That was one of the things I suggested. We did a 2+2 with Korea, and also with Japan. And our the depth of our security and economic relationship with Japan continues to be underestimated to this day. We've had a very successful trilateral Australia, US, Japan at foreign ministers level, and I persuaded the Japanese and the Americans to do it at defence level as well. So in filling in all of those trappings of our region, I think is very important. And so the resuscitation of the Quad now that both India and Japan and the US and Australia want to be in it is an unambiguously good thing. But trying to put the strands on the web of trilaterals, of anything you can do to engage one or two of our countries. So I'm a strong supporter of trying to do better with India, Indonesia, Australia trilateral, Japan, Indonesia, Australia trilateral. Any of these things in a multipolar world where there's a danger of not just competition but miscalculation between the two superpowers, US and China, is worth doing. Yeah. And part of our thinking at the time was we were all operating under the Bob Zalek response. China will be a responsible stakeholder. No one's expecting that China is going to be anything other than run by the Communist Party of China and the PLA, but it'll be a responsible stakeholder internationally. And that will enable hundreds of millions of people to come out of poverty in China, but also enable China's entry into the global economy to the benefit of not just Australia and the United States, but a range of economies. So you've now got 200 odd countries where China is their largest trading partner. But that was the responsible stakeholder days. We now have a dramatically changed China. So our thinking without ever articulating was that these are good things to do. And if for whatever reason the relationship with China goes bad, then there'll be not just good economic things to do, but good security things to do.
Were we getting China wrong?
Look, I think it's all too easy to look back at those days with what we know now. Mm. And so if you go to the 2 years after we left office and the coalition came to power, Xi Jinping became president sort of end of 2012, beginning of 2013. He came to Australia 2014, and the whole demeanour of his visit was essentially, if you like, in the context of the guise of China will be a responsible stakeholder. We knew him well. We thought we knew him well. And so I think it took until really China started to become much more assertive and aggressive on South China Sea, and more recently Hong Kong, the Uyghurs, essentially now saying, if you have a disagreement with China and we regard it as a core Chinese interest, we won't brook a conversation with you. And in Australia's case, economic punishment for policy decisions we've made. So I think the change came 2013, 2014. Yeah. And I think the responses that the Parliament and the government and the opposition have made as a general proposition are correct in terms of we're dealing with a changed China and we need to conduct ourselves accordingly. That's not to say that, like any country, China is a monolith. And so we still have to have a conversation with China. It may or may not be the case that Xi Jinping, is president for life. It may or may not be the case that China reverts to a policy of previous years of what we would describe as the Deng Xiaoping consensus or the responsible stakeholder. But in the meantime, we have to do a range of things on the economic front and the security front to do what Peter Varghese would say, to balance China.
Yes.
So you've got to, in Australia's case, our biggest project now has to be diversification of our trade and economy. But on the security front, has to be the interweaving of our alliance relationship with those multi-power arrangements that I previously referred to with India, with Indonesia, even with Vietnam. So I brought the Vietnamese Defence Minister to Australia for the first time to try and grow a relationship with Vietnam. And because they're a country of 100 million people, we have a history with them. They perversely regard us well. And they're going to be an ASEAN tiger. So we need to grow both economically and strategically with them as well.
I wanted to ask you a question about your relationship to two very different prime ministers. Really, predominantly, you were foreign minister for the Kevin Rudd time and defence minister for the Julia Gillard period. And reflecting on just what you've been saying, Stephen, it's also interesting that those two prime ministers wrestled in their own ways with the big strategic settings that you were discussing. For Kevin Rudd, you know, I think the defining document was the 2009 Defence White Paper, which really sketched out a more difficult and complex strategic environment for Australia. For Julia Gillard, it was more the Asian Century White Paper that she produced, which really talked about the upside opportunities for Australian engagement, primarily with the Big Five, including China, of course. What was it like to deal with two such different characters, both in terms of their work methods and their personal styles, over your time as Minister?
Well, look, we're talking defence, so let me deal with defence first. So for 2 years and 2 3/4 years, I was Defence Minister with Julia Gillard, and then for 3 months Defence Minister with Kevin. So I always found every dealing I had with Julia Gillard throughout my entire parliamentary and ministerial career was personable and professional. So I regard my time as Defence Minister with Julia as pretty much a classical, traditional Defence Minister, Prime Minister relationship. I would, of course, brief Julia and her office, her international advisor, on big issues, things going to national security, but everything else, essentially the deal was the traditional deal, which is you run the portfolio, you manage things. If there's anything that you think we need to know, tell us. And that worked very well. One of the things that is essential for a Defence Minister is you've got to have a good office. And I was blessed to have, as Chief of Staff and Deputy Chief of Staff, 2 individuals who were professional defence and public service officers who knew the system. And my Chief of Staff was Deputy Chief of Staff to Brendan Nelson. So, you know, in defence and foreign affairs, where 80% of what we do is across the aisle or bipartisan, it's essential to have professional defence or DFAT officers working with you. And so I had a very good relationship office to office and a very good personal professional relationship. I can't remember a disagreement that I had with Julia. I can remember plenty of conversations where we do the what if, what about this nuance, what about that, but pretty much we were at one. When Kevin became Prime Minister, I announced pretty quickly that I wouldn't be standing again in the Parliament, and so I remained as Defence Minister until David Johnston was sworn in. And so Kevin's eyes were essentially on, you know, we've got an election coming up in a short period of time, how can I maximise my chances for the election? I was by then the sole continuous member of the National Security Committee. So Kevin's brief to me was run defence, make sure everything's okay, and keep an eye out for anything that might be going to the National Security Committee, because I will need, you know, a solid hand. And so I did that, and I can remember to this day, still in bed because it was Western Australian time, as Jono was sworn in and responsibility fell from my shoulders, because both during the election campaign and the sort of lengthy period of time it took before a new government was sworn in, I had to do the usual, which you are very familiar with. Read the intelligence, make sure everything's okay, etc. So I had a real job to do. But Kevin essentially gave me a free hand, and that reflected, subject to the usual rules, of course, which is you've got to let the Prime Minister know if there's anything which might cause him concern. And despite all of the, if you like, publicity about Kevin as Prime Minister, that was essentially my relationship with him as Foreign Minister. Kevin, of course, given his background, had strong views in a number of areas and also strong views in a number of appointments, particularly the large ones. But essentially, I got into a work routine with Kevin where I knew the things that he was interested in, I knew the things that he was concerned about. We'd have our conversations about those. And if there was a disagreement, the approach I took was the same advice and conversation I had with Gareth Evans when Gareth Evans discovered that he was no longer Foreign Minister to Bob Hawke, but Foreign Minister to Paul Keating. Yep. And I was, you know, senior advisor to Paul, and Gareth came in the room, and, you know, Gareth said, I've got to get in the door, I have to brief the Prime Minister. And I said, well, you'll get in the door in an orderly fashion. And I said, but Gareth, you know, there's as you know, Paul is a man of views. He will have views, and there's only one rule, which is if there's a crack of light, there can't be a crack of light between the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister. And so if there's a difference of views, the difference is resolved in there, not out there. And that was my approach. If there was ever a difference of view between the Foreign Minister and the Prime Minister, or the Defence Minister and the Prime Minister, that was resolved behind closed doors, and after that there was never a crack of light. But my dealings with Kevin in the portfolio were again both personal and professional, less so in the raw politics.
I wanted to ask you about a couple of more or less domestic defence issues in closing up, Stephen. One was around the budget. So we had a situation where in the 2009 Defence White Paper, the government articulated a quite ambitious defence budget future for the organisation, a doubling of the submarine fleet, for example. By the time we get to the 2013 Defence White Paper, which was on your watch, we all of a sudden have a significant squeezing of the defence budget, really around the global financial crisis. But can you talk me through the experience of how that kind of played out?
Well, you've reminded me to answer your question about the 2009 White Paper, which was Joel Fitzgibbon and Kevin as Prime Minister.
Yes.
Then the National Security Statement under Julia, and the Asian Century White Paper, which was variously 2011, end of 2011, beginning of 2012, and then my own White Paper. I take slight issue with you on the Asia Century White Paper. The Asia Century White Paper was essentially, here is the economic opportunity that presents itself with a rising Asia or a rising Indo-Pacific. The opportunities in India, in Japan, Korea, Indonesia, etc. And so that was an economic opportunity document. You and I both know that you can't have economic opportunity without stability and security, so the two go hand in hand. When you look at the 2009 Defence White Paper, the National Security Strategy beginning of 2012, and my own White Paper, which was sort of June, July of 2013, there is a couple of constants. One constant is that each of those documents refers to the relationship between China and the United States as being the key to stability, security, and lack of conflict. And so that's central to all of them. In my White Paper, you've got, for the first time, express reference to the Indo-Pacific. 2009 White Paper was notable for the traditional approach it took to what's the role of defence in the Australian context. Made the point about China and the US being key to ongoing stability, and then dealt with a range of capability issues in the main, sort of future submarine, but a range of other things. And that was described as Force 2030. Despite all of the criticisms or commentaries, you go from that White Paper, Force 2030, to my White Paper, to Maurice Payne, the David Johnson-Maurice Payne White Paper in 2017. That mainstay for what we called Force 2030 continues. So the future submarines continues, and a range of other assets. And when the 2009 Defence White Paper came out, the fiscal and financial circumstances were light years away from mine, which was the post-global financial crisis. So for my sins, I became Defence Minister and a member of the ERC. So I had to, and I'm not sure in the end whether that was an advantage or a disadvantage. So I had to grapple with a reducing budget. And so I had been around long enough to know that if we were going into a return to surplus environment and cuts had to be made, that defence would be one of the obvious areas where it's a large spending budget. So defence, development assistance, health, education, and the like. As you know, there's only 5 or 6 bus stops you can go to when you're looking for revenue. And my approach was, rather than getting into a paper war with Treasury commenting on defence, etc., that if we got an idea of what was required from defence in terms of our contribution over the forward estimates and in individual financial years, that if we were left alone to manage that ourselves, then we would be able to protect the things that needed protecting. So the last thing I wanted was Treasury and Finance trampling all over defence in a reducing budget environment. So I'd get agreement from ERC about what the ballpark was ERC was looking for. Sit down, with Dennis, and before Dennis with Duncan, and before Duncan with Watty, Ian Watt, and say, okay, this will be the ask, can we manage that? And if the answer was no, we can't manage that, I'd go back and say, I can give you this, I can't give you that. And then we would do a range of things. We would make sure that Afghanistan was ring-fenced, and this was the advice from John Forker. So at every given time, we ring-fenced Afghanistan. Then we looked at capability and said, okay, what's the capability that we need that we can either keep in the slot or advance in the slot? And what's the capability that we can move to the left to push back a bit, which won't end up with a capability gap? Because I'd been chastened by the capability gap of the supply ships, which I had inherited. Yep. So I wanted to make sure Afghanistan is inviolate. What's the key capability that we need and the key things we need to do to make sure that the show continues, that we keep being a running and going concern, and what can we trim and what can we push back? And I think, in my own view, we did that successfully. So in terms of, throughout that period, in terms of capability, we still managed to double our C-17 fleet. We still managed to get Super Hornets and Growler. We still managed to, in the collapse of our heavy lift and supply ships, to replace that by purchasing offshore. We continued the implementation of air warfare destroyers and landing helicopter docks. We continued the revitalisation of the old frigates. And I think the key, I look back at that period and I say, okay, I was criticised for moving some things to the left, for delaying some capability. But in the years that followed my departure, are there any illustrations of where there was a gap in capability? Mm-hmm. And the main thing that we were asked to do post my time in office in recent years was air interdiction over Syria with ISIS, where we used Hornets, Super Hornets and Growler because the Joint Strike Fighter had not yet arrived. Brendan Nelson, Joel Fitzgibbon and I had big challenges with defence because Defence's view from day one was we only need Joint Strike Fighter, we don't need anything else. Mm-hmm. And so Brendan got two squadrons of Super Hornets against the advice of Defence. Joel Fitzgibbon in his white paper kept the notion of Growler electronic warfare open. And when I got the National Security Committee to agree to Growler, the only country other than the United States that has it, I wouldn't normally say this, but Bob Carr's already written about it. It was against the advice and co-word comments of Defence, PM&C, Treasury, Finance, and nonetheless we won the day because it was a sensible thing to do. So we were still able to substantially enhance Air Force's capability. The previous government had enhanced maritime capability with air warfare destroyers and landing helicopter docks. I inherited those programs, which had their own difficulties, but nonetheless we got through. Our big problems in terms of maritime capability was when I became minister, there were 0 to 1 Collins-class submarines in the water, and there was no heavy lift or supply vessels that could provide any service to Australia. So a combination of the Rizzo review into supply ships and the Coles review into submarines. When I left, my successors inherited 4 Collins-class submarines in the water on a daily basis, which is world-class, whereas when I inherited, we were last in class. So the work we did in patching up the supply ships, awaiting the arrival of the LHDs through the Choules and other purchases, and then putting the Collins-class submarine back into the water, plus doing the life extension work on the Collins, because what was driving me was I don't want there to be a gap in capability between the Collins and the future submarine. And all of our effort on future submarine was to make sure that we would have, if we were re-elected, or our successor would have, essentially as a live option what we used to describe as an evolving Collins, or what I described as son or daughter of Collins.
Yes.
So, and that required fixing up the maintenance and sustainment. It also required me going to Sweden on 3 occasions to lock up the IP. And so when we handed over Future Submarine, a live option was son or daughter of Collins. And it was of some surprise to me that that option was effectively excluded from the subsequent government's consideration of future submarines.
Stephen, in the time we've got left to us, as you look back on your experience in the portfolio, what stands out for you as the things you're most satisfied about, and also what are the things that you perhaps would have done differently if you could have a second go?
Well, if I can deal with the second one first, I always respond to that, in a sense, adversely. I think as a minister, all you can ever do is say, okay, put myself in a position where all of the evidence, all of the views, all the information that I need to make a decision are there in front of me at the time that I make it. And I make that. On a good day, if you get 7 out of 10 things right, you're doing very well. And so I am very satisfied that on the vast bulk of issues, particularly the key ones, that I had in front of me what I regarded as what's the evidence about where we are and what's the sensible decision to make in Australia's national and national security interests. So I've got, in a sense, no regrets, and I've got no compulsion, unlike other people I've seen generally in other jurisdictions, to revisit things or to recant that which we did. And I think during that period as a member of the National Security Committee, there wasn't anything of moment that we missed or dropped the ball on in terms of national security. In terms of the one thing that, of course, you'd never have, which you always want more of, is more time.
Right.
You always want more time. In terms of successes, I'll recant some of the things that we've spoken about, but one thing that we haven't spoken about is the cultural reviews and the cultural changes that I brought to defence. This was not done without a fight, and it crystallised with a young woman at ADFA being sexually humiliated, having consensual sex with a colleague cadet, but that colleague then putting it online for the whole world to see, an offence for which he was subsequently convicted. So she was humiliated. Within 36 hours, the Commandant of ADFA had charged her for disciplinary breaches in entirely unrelated matters. That's called blaming the victim. And so I said to Defence, it's not tenable for him to remain in his position. We agreed pretty quickly about a whole range of reviews that we would do: treatment of women, use of alcohol, how people should conduct themselves. That was very strongly supported by the Chief, the Vice Chief and the Service Chiefs, and that was a program that worked very well. What we fought about was the ongoing role of the Commandant. Now, you and I have both read the Defence Act, and of course that's entirely a matter for Defence. It's not a matter for the Minister, nor should it be. But I made it absolutely crystal clear to the Chief down that unless something occurred to reflect the fact that he had made a fundamental error of judgment in blaming the victim, that when I was next asked, I would essentially say, that's a matter for the Chief and a matter for the Service Chiefs. They're not doing anything, and I strongly oppose that. I don't support that at all. In the event, he went on leave, and then we slowly worked our way through the reviews. Because she had been humiliated, a de facto sexual assault, what that brought to the fore were thousands of complaints from other people who'd been treated in the same way. So I had to find a process where they could be managed. And I was lucky enough that Len Roberts-Smith, a former judge of the Supreme Court of WA, but also a senior reservist, agreed to essentially work on those issues for me. And Len and his team came up with a process of what was called restorative justice, that anyone who had a complaint, and we set a modest monetary amount for financial compensation. Anyone who had a complaint could go before a senior military official, tell his or her story, and then have a response. And that system of restorative justice worked fantastically well. A lot of the anecdotal comments I got from people who'd been bullied or brutalised or sexually assaulted or humiliated in the course of their time in defence, whether it was in the 1950s or 60s as a 15-year-old cadet to much more recent times, was this happened to me. All I ever wanted was for someone to hear my story and not turn a blind eye.
Yep.
And the restorative justice process, that required senior officials, senior military officers from the chief down to take part in the restorative justice process where everyone from the chief down would hear a person's story. That had a profound effect upon the senior uniformed officers, and the penny dropped. There has been bad culture, terrible things have occurred, and we now have to stop that and change. So that restorative justice process was deeply significant. The other thing that we did was that we adopted a US model, which is if you've been assaulted or sexually assaulted, then you can complain and report to someone outside your chain of command, because the long-standing complaint had been often the allegations were against a supervising officer or someone in the chain of command. So, and if those events which occurred back in my time were to occur today, there would be monumental outrage. So everything that occurred then, you know, I did not take a backward step, and I'm proud that I didn't. It was the right thing to do, but I don't need to tell anyone I was also on the right side of history.
Right.
Because if those events had occurred today and the service chiefs had not moved voluntarily to do it, they would have been scarified in public like many other people have been scarified. So I'm very proud of that. I'm very proud of the work we did on the Indo-Pacific and being, you know, the first minister to put into a Commonwealth official document the notion of the Indo-Pacific. Very proud of the work I did to work with the United States on those enhanced operational measures, but also through OSMIN. If you look at the OSMIN communiques over those 5 or 6 meetings, we did a lot of work which is not much commented upon in space, in communications, in technology and in cyber, which set the scene for an area which is now a very live area. So that's a good body of work. And so, you know, I often say to people, the OSMIN communiques tell you a lot, just go off and read them. So proud of the work I did with the US. One of the cyber things we did was that Dennis Richardson and I included in the 2013 white paper the notion of the Defence Signals Directorate becoming the Australian Signals Directorate, because we could see cyber was now going to overtake telephonic communication, and it would be an issue which would be across the board. And so we set the scene for the now Australian Signals Directorate and for the ASD to be essentially a statutory authority in its own right, albeit under the defence portfolio. Some successes in defence you take by the avoidance of a disaster or debacle. So I was very pleased with the way in which we made our commitment in Afghanistan, made our contribution, and then essentially got out with dignity. It also enabled us to grow a relationship, in a sense perversely, with NATO and the European Union, given the match of those things. So if you said, what do I look back on and feel proud about, or say, well, that moved the needle a bit. There are a lot of things you do which is play on, but some things you do is because it's your tour of duty and your time. I'm proud of the work I did in trying to ensure that men and women in uniform were treated with civility and dignity and respect, and not bullied or harassed. Work that we did with the United States, enhanced measures plus OSMIN, the notion of the Indo-Pacific and reaching out directly to India, Indonesia, other countries to try and set the scene for that, enhancing the architecture of our defence diplomacy, the early work we did on cyber, the work that we did in Air Force capability transformed Air Force. So whilst there's a range of criticisms about the lack of money and capability, we transformed Air Force with C-17s, commitment for C-27s, but most importantly Super Hornets and Growler, so there was no gap of capability. And I'm also proud of the work that we did in getting the Collins-class submarine back into the water. When it's in the water, it's world-class.
Stephen, it's been a great conversation. I'm conscious that we've gone a little over time, but I want to ask you two things just very quickly to close. First one of which you might find, I don't know, perhaps slightly a surprising question, but was the experience of being Defence Minister a lonely experience?
Well, so yes and no. It's a good question. The fact that you're in a warlike operation for the entire time as Defence Minister doesn't help. The fatalities are terrible. But I found with Defence, there's a surprisingly few number of people, for the obvious security reasons, that you can share things with.
Yeah.
So what helped me a lot was, I got on very well with my senior staff. I got on very well with Julia Gillard, who was Prime Minister for the bulk of my time in Defence. Got on very well with Dennis Richardson, but also with the others, Ian Watt and Duncan. So that helps, and got on very well. I had a lot of regard for the service chiefs who I recommended to Julia, go to their role. So I was blessed by very good service chiefs. So that helps. And despite the very high tensions on the cultural issues, particularly the ADFA issue, I never, in my view, lost a professional working relationship with those key people. For me, as a minister, my respite and what worked for me was the fact that I came from Perth. So if I wasn't travelling overseas, I did everything I could to make sure that I was back in Perth on a Friday night and leaving on a Sunday night or a Monday morning. So to me, Perth, family, local surrounds, sure, there was plenty of work to do. When they wheeled in the Defence double-sized secure briefcase, with DFAT it would be 3 or 4, with Defence it would be 8 or 9. So there's no, but what gave me respite was I could come back to Perth, I could deal with crises, I could deal with the paperwork, I could do this or that, but I was within a familiar surround, the comfort of home, the comfort of family, and you could just be an ordinary resident of Mount Lawley, Perth, and no one really cared. But it can be, there are not many colleagues who you can go to. You can go to your predecessors, you can go to the Foreign Minister, but there's not a wide circle of confidence you can have as you can have in a domestic portfolio. Same is true in a sense of foreign affairs, but foreign affairs is overall an easier portfolio in terms of the things that you have to deal with. Sure, you have the occasional consular crisis and people are in trouble overseas, but they're in a sense intermittent. I think the overriding thing about Defence is it's ever present, and it's always different and difficult. And of course, one anecdote. Brendan Nelson, one of my predecessors, as Foreign Minister, we appointed Brendan to ambassador to NATO, and that was very important. He was very good. His defence experience helped us a lot, in terms of what we were doing in NATO. And I remember my first visit with Brendan as Defence Minister, and Brendan would say, he said, "Stephen, well, when I had my first meeting with the Chief and the Secretary, they handed over the brief, and then as I go out the door, the Secretary stayed behind and said, 'Minister, I just need to let you know, Minister, there will be surprises. We will let you down. There will be issues.' And I said, 'Brendan, you don't need to worry. It's now in the covering letter of the incoming government brief.' So they didn't tell me, they wrote it to me. 'Minister, there will be surprises. Yeah. Minister, we will let you down. Minister, there will be times when it's very difficult.' And that's not because, even with terrible capability failures for whom no one ever seems to be accountable, it's not as if anyone is out there saying, I'm doing everything I can to stuff up this capability project. Everyone's got the best of intentions. Yes. It's just the different silos, the different perspectives, and putting a big unwieldy beast into a manageable compartment. Yeah. They tend to be the issues. But look, it changed my life, both foreign and defence and the National Security Committee. I didn't envisage that when I entered Parliament. I didn't envisage it when I entered the ministry. But as you can see from the backdrop, it's something that I carry with me for the rest of my academic career and life generally.
So in closing, what advice would you give to a new person who might ring you up and say, hey, I'm about to become Minister for Defence, what should I do?
What should you do? You should speak to all of your predecessors, because they'll all have a conversation with you.
Yeah.
And you should just learn from them some of the challenges that you're going to have, and there are some early lessons to be learned. But you've got to be assiduous, you have to be fastidious, it'll take over your life for the period of time. But you also have to be clear-sighted. Don't let the volume of detail get in the way of what's the strategic outcome that's required here. What are the things that we need to do? And so it's the old adage of, if you become a minister, you walk in the door, you've got 5 things written on the palm of your hand, and if you get 3 of those 5 things done, you've done well. Yeah. But it's best advice I can give is that you've got to go into it with your eyes open. There is a camaraderie, which is, if you're a member of the former Defence Ministers Club, which can be very helpful to future ministers. So you've got to do it with your eyes open. You need to understand there will be surprises, you will be let down, but you just got to work through those issues and get to the strategic outcomes that protects and defends our national interest.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
It's been a great pleasure.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.